Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a massive, high-stakes legal clash between the United States and Vietnam over international shrimp tariffs. It's a fascinating story, full of complex calculations, multi-year legal maneuvers, and a global tug-of-war that ultimately changed how seafood moves across the entire world.
But before we get into the legal weeds, let's talk about the stakes. Because these complex trade mechanics aren't just dry paperwork, they have massive economic consequences. In fact, the policies we're about to dissect contributed to a devastating 60% drop in Vietnamese shrimp export shipments to the U.S. in February 2026. Real businesses, real livelihoods, and massive supply chains were completely upended here.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the origins of the global shrimp war, break down a controversial math practice called zeroing, look at the single entity presumption, unpack the WTO's final verdict, and then explore the real-world fallout. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The Global Shrimp War and the Origins of this Dispute.
We're starting our chronicle back in 2004. At that time, a petition by U.S. shrimp producers resulted in the Department of Commerce imposing heavy anti-dumping duties on frozen warm water shrimp imported from Vietnam. Now, the goal here was to protect domestic producers from foreign goods that were allegedly being sold below fair market value. But the impact on Vietnam? It was severe. For years, major Vietnamese shrimp companies, businesses like Stapamex and Tang Xuan, suddenly faced crushing cash deposit rates hovering right around 25%, and in some cases, before offsets, they were approaching 90%. It was a massive, virtually insurmountable financial barrier to entry.
Which brings us to Section 2, Unfair Math, Zeroing, and how these margins are actually calculated.
So to understand how these duties got so incredibly high, we really have to look at the mechanical problems at the heart of Vietnam's WTO complaint. And it starts with a highly controversial mathematical calculation called zeroing. Think of zeroing kind of like calculating your average grade on a test, but your teacher decides to count all of your A's as straight zeros. Obviously, that mathematically inflates your final failure rate, right? Well, by ignoring the transactions where shrimp was actually sold above fair value, the U.S. mathematically inflated the overall dumping margin, which in turn triggered much higher tariffs. Now, in the name of complete neutrality, let's look at both sides of this argument. Vietnam took this to the WTO, arguing that this unfair math explicitly violated the anti-dumping agreement, specifically Article 9.3, which says duties absolutely shouldn't exceed the actual dumping margin. Vietnam claimed simple zeroing systematically inflated those margins. On the other side of the aisle, the U.S. vigorously defended its methodology. Their defense rested on the fact that the anti-dumping agreement doesn't expressly forbid transaction-specific offsets or zeroing in administrative reviews. Essentially, they argued it was a legally permissible interpretation of the rules.
Moving on to Section 3, the Single Entity Presumption, also known as the NME problem.
This was the second major mechanical roadblock Vietnam challenged, exactly how the United States categorized Vietnamese shrimp exporters during their investigations. This brings us to the non-market economy, or NME presumption. Instead of calculating duties company by individual company, this NME presumption grouped hundreds of completely independent Vietnamese businesses together. It started with the default assumption that they were all just one single government-controlled entity. As you can imagine, this placed the heavy burden of proof completely onto the exporters to prove they were in fact independent.
And again, we've got a fascinating clash of legal perspectives here. Vietnam argued this blanket presumption was completely illegal under the Anti-Dumping Agreement's Article 6.10, claiming it unlawfully reversed the burden of proof and denied companies the individual margin calculations they deserved. The United States, however, countered that Vietnam's very own WTO accession protocol actually authorized this exact non-market methodology. The U.S. position was that until Vietnam could conclusively prove market economy status under U.S. law, treating them as a single entity was entirely justified. All right, Section 4, the WTO panel verdict and the actual results of dispute DS429. With the battle lines firmly drawn over math and entity presumptions, Vietnam officially requested a WTO panel in 2012, kicking off what became known as Dispute DS429. And honestly, the sheer scale of this process is staggering. The grueling bureaucratic path of international trade law stretched from the initial consultations through the establishment of the panel all the way down to the final arbitration award. It is absolutely not a swift process. Looking at the timeline itself, you really see how this builds. Vietnam requested consultations in early 2012. The WTO panel was established that summer. But it wasn't until late 2014 that the unadopted panel report was even circulated. Then came the appeals, meaning the final reports weren't adopted until April 2015. Finally, an arbitration award regarding implementation was issued in 2016. That is 4 full years of legal maneuvering before the independent arbitrator finally issued a ruling giving the U.S. 6 months to comply.
So, after all that time, who actually won? Well, it was a split decision, though one that heavily favored Vietnam's core complaints. Vietnam won decisively on the zeroing issue, at least regarding how it was applied in these specific reviews. And they won both as such and as applied when it came to the enemy-wide entity presumption. However, the U.S. successfully defended Section 129 of its domestic law. That's the law governing how the U.S. handles unliquidated duties, meaning tariffs that haven't been finalized yet following a WTO ruling.
Let's break down those specifics just a bit more. The panel found that simple zeroing, as applied, definitely violated Article 9.3. They also ruled the U.S. enemy entity policy violated Article 6.10, as such, meaning the underlying policy itself was flawed. They struck down the Vietnam-wide presumption and even ruled that U.S. sunset reviews, which determined if duties should continue, were inconsistent because they relied on those illegal zeroed margins. But here's the crucial takeaway. While the U.S. was ordered to fix its math and drop the blanket single-entity presumption, the WTO did not invalidate the American laws themselves. U.S. Section 129 survived the challenge intact.
Finally, Section 5, the real-world fallout and the economic impacts.
What did this highly technical, acronym-heavy ruling actually mean for real-world exporters in Vietnam and seafood buyers in the United States? Well, as a direct result of Vietnam's legal persistence, we saw a massive, tangible victory on paper. The sweeping all-others tariff rate, which penalized any company that couldn't prove its independence from the Vietnamese government, was eventually slashed from a whopping 35.29% all the way down to roughly 4.6% in the 19th Administrative Review.
But, the victory didn't just magically erase all the hurdles. The global trade landscape is deeply complicated. Despite these massive legal wins, major firms still faced high cash deposits, hovering around 25% even years later. The market uncertainty and the lingering tariffs really took their toll, prompting Vietnamese industry groups, like VASEP, to advise their exporters to aggressively diversify their shipments away from the U.S. entirely and lean heavily into the EU and Chinese markets instead.
Because at the end of the day, getting a favorable ruling is really only half the battle. As our source material points out, the reality of global trade is that continuous diplomatic leverage and vigilance are required to actually ensure compliance. You can't just win a case and walk away. You have to continually monitor compliance, use the WTO toolbox to enforce the ruling, and complement that legal win with ongoing high-level trade diplomacy.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If an obscure mathematical rule, applied in a windowless bureaucratic office somewhere, can literally wipe out 60% of a country's export shipments, how deeply do these invisible trade laws shape the cost of the food on your plate every single day? Next time you buy seafood, take a second to consider the years-long international legal battles that determined exactly how it got to your grocery store and what it cost to get there. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep exploring the hidden systems that shape our world.